Good morning, good afternoon, wherever in the world that you might be. It's one or the other, but thanks for being here with us today. I'm Geth Davis. You may have seen me on these before, Key Account Specialist at Cloud Essentials. I'll be introducing today's webinar, top and tailing as we like to call it, which is the easy part of introducing what's coming, and then the wrapping up with some key takeaways in the end. So thankfully, I've got a real specialist in Azure to help and guide us through the session today. We make sure that it's insightful. So we've got the brilliant Vikar Singh, Cloud Solution Architect here at Cloud Essentials. He's an expert in cloud migration and Microsoft ecosystems, so it'll be great to hear, I guess, his guidance and thoughts on today's topic. He's a perfect man for the job. So you've probably got an idea of what we're going to cover. Just from reading some of the information that you had when you signed up, but we've kind of simplified the title for today's webinar. So we're looking at Azure cost optimization. So taking back control of spiraling Azure costs. We're going to, I suppose, uncover through real world examples from Vikar's vast experience, why Azure costs can spiral, and then how to regain control through actionable strategies as well. So main goal of the session being, how we equip you as attendees with tools to optimize budgets without sacrificing performance, essentially. So we're going to look at, why cost optimization matters. We're going to look at some common Azure cost challenges, some general housekeeping that everybody can sort of take away from today, easy and practical ways that you can optimize costs, and then some steps for sort of longer term goals and automation as well. We'll also touch on some services that we provide at Cloud Essentials, specifically around sort of the support and management of Azure as well. And I guess time-wise, we should have time at the end to open it up to some questions. So I would just encourage you to participate. Please post any questions. The chat is live, so if you've got any questions that come to you along the way, please post them on there, and we'll do our best to get to them before the end as well. The format is going to be mics off, as you've probably recognized by your current status on there. So yeah, like I said, post any questions that you've got along the way. Just before we jump into it, some of you here today are new to Cloud Essentials. Some of you aren't, so you would have heard this before, but it's always good to just remind everyone, where we sit and where our expertise lie. So Cloud Essentials are a long-standing and dedicated Microsoft 365 partner. We specialize in areas of content management, so help organizations mature their approach in areas like, reducing the risk profile of your content in M365, migrating and managing the content cost effectively, ultimately opening the value in content so you can surface it to your business advantage. And that's especially relevant in today's AI landscape as well. We also cover, multiple other areas, including, complex migrations, Power Platform application development, and e-discovery expertise as well. And then obviously, what we're here to cover today, which is that expertise and know-how when it comes to anything Azure related. On that note, and without further ado, I'm going to pass you over to our resident Azure expert, Vikar Singh. So Vic, over to you.
Thanks for that, Gethin. So I'll just pretty much kick off straight away. Why do cost optimization actually matters in Azure? Now, I'm sure you can picture a project that's been derailed by a surprise Azure bill. I'm sure it sounds familiar to everyone on this call. It's a lot more common than you think. And just looking at the numbers from the last Gartner report in 2023, it says 80% of organizations are overspending in cloud. So essentially, it's 4 out of 5 of us. And it's not really a niche problem anymore. And what's the main culprit from all of this? It often isn't in the cloud itself, but it's how we handle it. And that's the main point of why we're here today. So cost overruns aren't just a financial issue. They essentially erode the trust that we have in the cloud's ROI, and it slows down our business quite a lot. But there is some good news. A lot of things are preventable, and I think that's the main focus on why we're here today. So just moving on to my next slide. I've added this as the first point to cover, which I think is really crucial, where I do see a lot of our customers falling short sometimes. And I'm sure you guys have also noticed that cost keeps creeping up, and how do we get ahead of this? And I think that's where governance comes in. It's our chance to really take control of our environment. So how do we start? It all begins on seeing what's really going on. The lack of visibility really causes a lot of issues, and with the right tools, you can spot every dollar, like often resources or resources piling up in the background, and just being able to see everything very clearly. And it becomes like not just guessing, because I have seen some customers in the past where there's a lot of resources piling up in the background, and when it comes time to reporting this to the business at the end of the month or bi-weekly, it's a scramble. So seeing is just the start of it, and the foundation really has to hold up in your environment. And again, weak architecture kind of causes a lot of issues. A solid foundation turns growth into advantages and not just random cost spikes. So we need to be able to scale properly. So the planning needs to be done prior to us really expanding out. And I've seen, unfortunately, some customers where, they've started their cloud journey and POC environments or test environments somehow become production, and then it kind of just starts scaling out like crazy, and it becomes more difficult to add these controls in at a later stage, but it is doable. So we need to have some type of control and just make sure there's no chaos. Now, I would say policies are real guardrails in all of this. With smart rules, we can keep our provisioning very lean. We can make sure we are right-sizing resources using the correct regions that we have access to. And it just adds a lot of redundancy everywhere. So efficiency by design. Now, speaking of the design, who we choose to actually work with really matters. Picking the right vendors and optimizing solutions upfront really saves us a lot of costs in the long run. So as a cost saver from day one, you can avoid overspending by aligning with what works for the cloud and what works for you. And again, I've seen this firsthand where, we are put in some situations where we can, instead of migrating legacy apps across, we can choose brand new solutions to leverage all of the cloud services. And sometimes we might not be picking the correct vendors or solutions to fully utilize that. Just a very random example from one of my previous customers overseas. We had a whole bunch of AKS clusters in our environments. The team was trained up, everything was great, and then the solution was chosen by the business to push out because there was some global partnership, and somehow this turned out to deploy in a whole bunch of AKS clusters on VMs that are running in Azure. And I would say the main problem with this, besides it adding a lot of overspend, the business then came back and said that the cloud doesn't make a lot of sense. So just by choosing the right vendors and solutions, sometimes, we can really build a lot of trust in the cloud and try and get the most out of what we spend. So just the last point on this is audits. And I think a lot of us need to start changing our mindsets on audits. We can't be stuck in the past anymore where we would audit our environment, plan for renewals, and just do a check every few years. This is something that needs to happen on an ongoing basis, and we need to stay ahead of the drift. Sometimes when you plan a deployment or migration over to Azure, it might make a lot of sense to do certain things right now, but those needs might change 6 months or a year down the line. So it gives us a good way to control the costs and any drift that actually happens, and it all pays off at the end. So just to recap, with governance, we are managing and not just reacting to things that are happening in our environment. It's really our edge and turning whatever risks that we can see into opportunities to save and scale. If you guys have gone through the Microsoft well-architected framework, they do attach like governance to cost control. So it's a really good read that I recommend everyone goes through, but a lot of the points that we do cover on today's session will be part of that. So just moving on now to our next slide. Azure gives us a lot of flexibility, and I'm sure everyone on this call has used Azure in some capacity. And I think one of the benefits is, it gives us the power to spin up resources and do a lot of things that we couldn't have done in the past with planning out our environments or data centers. So we can scale on demand and get resources and services up in minutes. Now, the problem with that is all that power, there is a catch, right? And it adds a lot of complexity. So sometimes being so simple and having simplicity adds a lot of complexity on it. And it actually hides a lot of cost traps that really sneak up on us. So like, what are these traps? And I can just go through some of these examples that I've actually listed down here. So like unexpected cost spikes, the billing confusion, over provisioning, inefficient services, licensing mix-ups, missed savings, data headaches, governance gaps like we previously covered, third-party scaling quirks, and the quiet silent killer that I see a lot of organizations facing right now is a lot of admin overhead, and none of really a cost that's being tracked properly. So I'm sure some of these things sound really familiar to a lot of us on the call right now, and it's problems that we're probably going to be facing as we proceed with our journey to the cloud and trying to optimize. So let's get started, right? So if we take unexpected costs, like I'm sure you can picture a VM in your environment that you forgot to shut down, or a development team was working on a project and they just left the resources spinning and running, and all of these things are racking up charges. Or even data egress is moving stuff out of Azure. Again, it's stuff that we don't really account for when we're doing our cost planning. So if we just take egress costs, for example, we're looking at 8 cents per gig or sometimes more depending on our region. And all of these things really adds up really fast. So if you're not really watching and have the right information up front, these things can really catch us at the end of the month when we start doing reporting and can blow up our budgets out completely. So if we take a look at complexity, right? Now, complexity, it really depends environment to environment. But if we take this as an example, if you have multiple subscriptions, whether they're vendor managed or your own, maybe you have a hub and spoke environment. Sometimes to do the hybrid billing, it's really like some type of fog just rolling in and blurs what you can actually see. And if you don't have the right tools and procedures in place, it becomes really painful. So where's your money going at the end of the month? You can probably sometimes see that you have a total cost, but trying to make sense of that total cost can become a real pain. So if you lose track of these things entirely, the prices just keep racking up. Just moving on now to the next one. And I see this, I can't explain how much I see this in some of our customers' environments, and that is over provisioning. So if we take like a classic one, for example, right? This is one of the biggest cost traps that I've seen. If we take a VM spec size for, say, a D16 VM, I've seen customers have VMs very similar to this, when a D2 could have accomplished the same thing for the same performance at half the cost. So by changing this, sometimes we can reduce our bill by half. It's like buying a truck to haul a suitcase. It just doesn't make a lot of sense, and it happens a lot more than you think. Now, speaking about choices, right? Like, we can just touch on like inefficient services. So I think about running IaaS VMs when PaaS like app services could save us all the management headache, the scaling, the DR, and the backup griefs. It's something that's, I would say, like, it's very often overlooked. Or if we just sticking, say, cold data on premium SSDs at 15 cents a gig when the archive storage could be 0.2%. Now, these numbers sound very small, but as your environment starts scaling out, or if you already have a large environment, we start talking about terabytes, it's literally hundreds and thousands of dollars that you could be saving. And it's not just services. Licensing is another spot that we can really win or lose with our cost-saving journey. So just touching on licenses really quick, I think it trips a lot of people up, and misusing bring your own licenses, or picking the wrong SKU in Azure can waste, I would say, like 30% or more of our cost savings that we can achieve. So if we think about bring your own licenses, so beside the Microsoft hybrid benefits, we're just using that if we are eligible for that, and which is why it's important to audit our licensing to see if we can make use of these benefits. We can save up to 30%. A lot of third-party providers, if we're using any security appliances, they might have a cloud option in Azure that we can deploy, and there would be some type of bring your own license. So it's just something to investigate as we start deploying more resources, or if you guys have deployed resources, it's something to keep an eye on to see if you can make any arrangements with your vendors or software providers, or just better reuse your Microsoft licensing for savings. So one other thing to look at is poor lifecycle management, right? It means that we're keeping a lot of data that we either don't use or we're overusing log analytics until the bull really shocks us, and weak governance really ties into this. So like no rules, no guardrails is all pure waste all the time. And it's not just internal, like outside tools and admin can also start piling up. We might need to purchase additional tool sets or softwares to try and fix inefficiencies that's happening in our environments, or if we are storing additional logs somewhere, all these things can just start piling up and add a lot to our costs. So third-party tools and auto scaling can also hurt us, in the long run. Azure gives us a lot of flexibility if we are using a lot of the serverless options to auto scale, but misconfigurations can really lead to a lot of overspend. If we have a lot of legacy applications that we're deploying as a cloud first or moving from on-premise, just the integration costs on those alone can really creep up, and sometimes it's not really planned for. So it's all a hidden tax, I would say. And again, like I touched on, manual admin work, like busy work. I'm sure all of us on this call have experienced this, sometime in our career where you could have been doing other things, but just a lot of busy work just kind of bogs you down. And so, like I said, it is a hidden tax, and you don't really see this until it's too late. So, like, why does this all matter, right? And these aren't just tech glitches or problems in our environment; they are all business risks, like forgotten resources, bad service picks, bad data sprawl. All of these things can really hit our budgets and our timelines, and it really affects our trust in the cloud. So it's not a trivial matter. It's very strategic, but I mean, there is some good news. There are ways to really fight back and optimize. So if we look at tools like Azure Advisor, Application Insights, Azure Monitor, Resource Graph, these things can spot a lot of waste. Cost management can track egress, PaaS solutions can simplify, and automation can really tame down the scaling and reduce any admin overhead. It could also help us do things like shut down dev test environments during non-production hours or spin them up when they are required. And policies in Azure can just lock it all down. So we have options to really fight back on this. So again, these traps are all real. I'm sure we've all experienced this or are experiencing this right now, but they are beatable, right? So just moving on now to my next slide. The one thing that I want to talk about really quickly is housekeeping. And unfortunately, I don't see this happen enough in some of the environments that I have worked with some of our customers. It's not a glamorous job, but it's a gold mine of where we can find savings. Why? Because like clutter in Azure, unused resources just sitting around, it costs us real money every single month. It's not like before where we have capacity on premise, we can just leave things running and try and claim that capacity back. We're being charged sometimes per hour for some of our resources. So what kind of clutter are we actually dealing with right here? I mean, we just think about VMs that you forgot or storage you don't need, IPs just hanging around for no reason. It's all waste just piling up. And that's cash that we can reclaim back, right? But to reclaim it, we need to know what we're looking for. So how do we spot these culprits? Like orphan resources, unused VMs, stray storage, blob backups, idle IPs, load balancers with no traffic going to it. They're all quiet, but again, they are costing us, right? So we need to start looking at some smarter practices. For storage, for example, we can look at things like setting up lifecycle rules. We can dump orphan blobs or snapshots that aren't being used anymore. I'm sure we've seen this in some of our environments where we have some applications that we might be looking at, we spin them up, it gets forgotten about, it gets backed up, and then we are storing all that information. Sometimes we delete the VM, but the blob or the disk that were attached to it is still there and running in our environment. It might have a public IP address that wasn't deleted. And again, these are all things that are piling up and adding to our costs every month. So look at is IOPS and on this. And I think this also catches a lot of people off guard. We have a lot of legacy applications that we are migrating to Azure or deploying in Azure sometimes. And as best practices for us, at least, we're trying to say we want to maximize our performance on these big VMs. Let's go and provision a whole bunch of SSD disks to try and help the performance. But unfortunately, some applications, they can't really leverage the SSDs. So it's this pure waste that's building up, which is why it's really important to check the IOPS. And all the tools that I mentioned previously with the reporting can really help us dive deep into that and get all the information that we need. So like backups also, we need to understand that all the logs that we are keeping, the backups, is any ways that we can go back to our business and confirm what data do we actually need. We need to be looking at trimming retention where possible. If we have any old backup vaults that aren't being used, that were migrated from, again, like I mentioned, any dev testing servers that were backed up for whatever reason, or old stuff, we need to be looking at deleting those from the vault. Because again, we are paying for this every single month. If we have a whole bunch of IP addresses, again, that might be used at a later stage, but they have been provisioned and we can't delete them for whatever reason, and for whatever reason they have been set to static, a very simple way to reduce costs is changing that to dynamic IP address if we need to keep it. Also, like netbooks is something else. Again, I've seen a lot of like orphan NICs and load balancers, application gateways, just hanging around for no reason. And again, like if we housekeep and identify these resources, we can clean it up. And again, it's not just these basic IaaS resources, right? It's something that we need to look and expand our search across SQL databases, containers, app services. We need to audit everything. And if we keep these good practices in place and auditing with the right reporting information coming back to speed things up, it really pays off big in the long run. So it's not busy work. And if we just take a really small example, if I have a 1 terabyte disk that's attached, that's detached and is hanging around in one of my subscriptions, that's averaging about $50 a month. Now, if we multiply that across multiple environments or subscriptions, we're looking at thousands of dollars that we could be saving by just tidying up. And again, you'll be surprised if you have a look at your environment and have the right reporting tools in place to identify these orphan resources. There's a lot of money just hanging around on the table. So housekeeping, to summarize this slide, is our first line of defense against waste. And I will move on to my next slide to cover some more examples and ways that we can save costs. So just some easy ways to optimize costs. And again, these are more best practices and things that we should be looking at. And let's start with some really easy wins. So ways to cut costs fast without breaking the sweat, right? If we look at our data, our licensing, sizing, that's where most of the magic happens. It requires very low effort that has really big returns. So if we kick this off, like the previous slide I mentioned, data lifecycle, if we're keeping all storage, like all data in hot storage, we're really burning a lot of cash. I mean, just think about it. I think on hot storage right now, it's about 15 cents a gig versus 0.2% for archive storage. So it's really important that we assess all our data and see like what do we actually need and where can it be stored to try to actually make things more efficient. Now, with blob storage, there are efficient ways to enable like lifecycle management that can automatically do that tiering for you. And I think it's a really great feature that a lot of our customers aren't taking advantage of. And that can automatically tier our data to hot, to cool, to archive storage. How do we go further? We can look at trimming retention. So it's a no-brainer, right? If we have any large data sets that are sitting on blob storage, and we know we're going to keep it for a very long time, if we just look at reserved instances of that, we can see massive savings over the long term. So like while we're on data, let's really just speak about really quickly log analytics. Now, if you're using log analytics, it's a great product, and I highly recommend everyone use it. It just provides so much insights. But the problem that I've seen sometimes is that the default retention on log analytics is about 30 days. Now, I've seen a lot of customers sometimes try to maximize that to 2 years, and that's a lot of ingestion, right? If we just think about it, I think per gig, it's sitting at 2.76 gigs per, like $2.76 per gig. And that adds up over time. So if you take multiple subscriptions, environments, you could be looking at thousands of dollars. When you start hitting terabytes of data, the costs really start racking up. So if you are using log analytics right now in your environment, it's very important to set some type of data caps, to be looking at archiving old logs, where you can literally save like hundreds of dollars per month. And then you also need to be asking the business, how much of this metric data do you actually need to keep? because a lot of people sometimes think as part of our data retention policies, we need to be matching that with our backups, which is not true, right? How valuable are these metric, like numbers to your business? So by just trimming that and having some control in place, you can really save a lot of money. For example, I had a customer that started off very small, but scaled really quickly. So the costing model that they chose for log analytics, it met the requirements up front, and they were keeping data for 2 years. But after 2 years of having this massive environment, by just making these slight tweaks in the environment, we saved them about $100,000 a year. So as you scale out, these small problems also scale with you. So it's very important to just make sure that you just wrap all these things up really tight and keep an eye on it. So that's one thing. Now, if we touch on the cloud pricing model, like I mentioned on my previous slide, if we look at the Windows licensing or third-party licensing, by just leveraging hybrid benefits, we can save up to 40% on our VMs. So if we aren't using these license benefits, we are really missing out, and it's costing us a fortune every single month. So again, it's really important to audit and see if you are eligible for these benefits, and it pays off in the long run. Speaking about pricing models, if we touch on SKUs really quickly, so I've seen a lot of customers use general purpose VMs, and there's nothing wrong with that, right? In most cases, it works out, it's great. But Azure offers us a massive SKU selection, and right-sizing our VMs up front can really save us a lot of money. So over-provisioning wastes money. And like I mentioned, just think about doubling our VM performance, which doubles our costs, and it's not being used. So, but if we go on the flip side, I know a lot of customers are scared of, if we don't scale it properly and choose the right SKU, we might have performance issues or downtime, and that adds a lot of risk to us in our business. So it's a really fine balancing act. But again, if you get the right information from your applications up front, you can make the right decisions. And Azure offers a lot of different types of SKUs also. It's not really so much about the size sometimes, it's about the type. So if you just look at matching the right VM to your workload, Azure has a lot of options to help us with that, and picking smart can really slash our costs down really quickly. As some examples, if we just go through this very quickly, if we have variable demands on some of our applications, so let's take like a test environment, for example. Instead of looking at general purpose VMs, burstable VMs, the B series, that's something that we should be looking at, where it bursts at very sporadic times and it's sitting idle most of the time. Just by choosing that SKU, from a general purpose VM, we can save about 50 to 60%, which is crazy, right? If we have any tasks that can be interrupted, right? So example, like a batch job. So whatever reason, we have VMs that are running batch jobs. If we use spot VMs, now essentially a spot VM uses spare capacity from Azure. So we can see up to a 60 to a 90% saving by just using spot VMs. Which is great, right? But then the problem with spot VMs is it could stop at any time, and Microsoft could reclaim back those resources. So, but again, if we plan ahead, we can overcome a lot of these challenges. Just thinking about like temporary VMs in our environment. Again, this is a very simple example, like dev test, or if we have any batch jobs that are running. Ephemeral disks are something that we should be looking at, because by using ephemeral disks, it skips the persistent storage cost. So we could be saving 5 to 15% savings straight away by just that one option. And again, if we have long-term workloads that are predictable, we understand the requirements of it, we can look at reserve instances. Now, reserve instances can help us with a 30 to 72% saving on our VM costs, which is great. And I see a lot of customers also, they don't really like spending for the next year or 3 years. But again, if we just look at the savings that we can achieve from this, it really helps in the long run. So an example, right? We had a customer that was using a SQL VM, right? And by just using reserve instances, you can the costs drop from about $200 a month to $80 a month. So if you work that out in the long run, that's about $1,000 savings per year. And I know some of our environments are a lot bigger than that. We are using bigger SKUs than that, but the same principles apply to that. If we look at a burstable VM, for example, for a test environment, we could literally save $100 for a general purpose VM, or we could use a $40 spot VM. And again, just savings in the long run, and we aren't just burning through cash for no reason. So these SKUs show that like balance, a burstable for flexibility, spot instances for cheaper, ephemeral for very short stints, and reserved instances if we have a long stable workload. So it's up to us to actually match the SKUs to our actual needs and requirements. But to nail that match, you need to have at least one tool in your toolbox, right? And again, it's just getting the reporting done can help all of us so much. So again, just another tip, Advisor. I see a lot of customers are using Advisor, and which is a great tool. But again, it's just one tool out of multiple tools that we could be using in our environment. So it's just not enough sometimes. And if you're looking at the basic criteria from what Advisor searches on, if you just leave it as is and rely on that, it's checking CPU, it's checking storage, and I think the timeframes is 8 or 10 days. I would need to double check. So it's not really giving us the full picture. If we have an application that's running in the background, and it's really busy like once per month, and we follow what Advisor tells us blindly, we can really add a lot of risk to our business. So it's really important to get the full picture, and we need to combine Advisor with like Azure Monitor for real metrics. There's a whole bunch of custom scripts that we can run for deeper queries on our applications, and we need to track this over time. And just getting the correct data allows us to make better decisions, so we decide on the smart solutions and not the fast ones. And again, all these tweaks, they really pay off in the long run. They're really small and powerful things that we can do. Tiered storage might save you thousands. Hybrid benefits can cut our VM costs down. Right sizing stops us from overpaying. And again, this really small moves with massive returns in the long run. And I'm sure a lot of us have caught the random Azure build sometimes where we think it's predictable. We've deployed everything in our environment, but due to some mishaps or new product deployments, we got these massive bills at the end of the month. So just to keep the savings rolling, I'm just going to go to my next slide to discuss more long-term things that we can be looking at. So it's about getting more from Azure with less hassle, right? And the reason why I call these things long-term goals for cost management, because they aren't, like the previous slide, really quick things that we can do in our environment. These things require a lot of planning or some type of migration cost upfront or upskilling for our teams, or we would need to get some type of vendor to come in to assist us with these things. So it's about getting more from Azure with less hassle. I mean, why should we stick with clunky IaaS solutions when there's a lot of PaaS and SaaS solutions on the marketplace in Microsoft right now that can save us money and a lot of effort? So I'll show you some just really quick ways on how we can just try and cut costs smartly for the long term. The first one would be web apps. Now, the web apps, and I see this, if we have a web app on a virtual machine, we need to worry about the uptime of that virtual machine, the patching, the backup, the redundancy. As an example, a D2S V3 VM will cost us about $70 a month. That's very low traffic, right? And if we just look at an Azure App Service that can auto scale, it can skip patching, the admin overhead is very minimal. A B1 tier for that equivalent type of resource is about $35 a month. So that saves us about 50%. Now, the B1 tier is very basic. It's for non-production, but even if we go for like a P1 or something like that, we can still look at massive savings up to 30 to 40% on that. So it's a really fast win, and Microsoft has a lot of tools to help us with this. If we just look at Azure Migrate, it can help us identify these opportunities and help us migrate our web service to web apps. If we have a DevOps team in our environment, we could be using DevOps to just refactor our code, and just really quick and fast wins. Just moving on now to databases. Again, if we just look at the costing, right? Like a VM database, for example, will cost us about $100 a month on a D2 V3. Now, that server is running 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. If we look at an Azure SQL serverless option, it pauses when it's idle. So we're only paying for what we're really using. So at 10 cents an hour, just running roughly at 10 hours a day, we're looking at $30. Now already that's a 70% saving just straight off the bat. If we have to double those hours to say 20 hours a week, right, it's still $60 and it's saving us about 40%. So depending on the downtime and the back-end requirements, we can be looking at a 50 to 70% savings and skipping all those downtime costs. Like, why should we be paying for something if our applications are idle during that time? Next up, that happens a lot, and I see this a lot in some of our customers and our previous customers, is file storage in Azure. So we see some people moving, and again, a very simple example. If I have a file server on site, I migrate that to Azure right now. I'm paying for the VM, I'm paying for the pricey storage. As an example, if I have a D2S v3 server again and a 1 terabyte, say, premium SSD storage, it's about $134 a month for static files. It doesn't make a lot of sense. Now, if these files aren't being accessed on a regular basis, which happens sometimes because, there's better options, why haven't these files been moved to SharePoint or OneDrive? But if we just look at archive storage, for example, we can essentially move all that data to archive storage at 2 cents per gig. So you're paying $2 for 1 terabyte. So you're saving about 95% of your overall cost for having this file server that's barely accessed. Now, if these files are being accessed, and again, like I touched on, if we haven't moved them to SharePoint and OneDrive, then we have other options like Azure Files, for example. So for Azure Files, we're looking at no infrastructure costs. It's pretty straightforward to set up, and it's about $60 a month for 1 terabyte of data, which saves us, again, about 90%. So if we look at all these cost savings, at 90 to 95%, we could be getting by just matching the tiers to our needs. A broader bill, for example, to give you more context, if I was spending $500 a month on a file server, I could literally drop that down to $5. So there's massive savings. Now, just moving on to containers. So what if you're running, say, 3 applications in your environment and are just at a very high level? Again, D2, V3 VMs. Now, as separate applications, that's going to cost us about $600 a month, right? But now if we switch that to AKS with this 2 D2 AS V5 nodes, that's about $260 a month. So in total, that saves us about 50% because the containers have the ability to share resources more efficiently than VMs. And on a bigger setup sprawl, if we have $1,000 worth of application on VMs, we could bring that down to about $300 by utilizing container services. So again, in the long run, it's a pretty smart way to modernize, and it comes with massive savings. Now, modernization delivers huge wins, right? We've seen all along, web apps can drop about 50%, databases about 70%, files about 95%, containers about 60%. If we are using messaging or batch jobs, we can hit about 80 to 90% savings on these. Overall, with just some small tweaks in your environment and long-term planning, if you're picking the right solutions up front or you're trying to modernize your applications, you could see anything from a 20 to 95% savings over time. So it's just something to keep in mind. And again, just to touch on this, while these savings are great, we need to understand that there are some upfront costs. There's a lot of effort for migrations, if there's any upskilling required for our teams, and we just need to work out if it makes sense for you and your business in the long term. If we have a lot of legacy applications that we've kind of mastered the entire approach of our reserved instances, our right sizing, and we plan to end of life these applications in 2 or 3 years, it doesn't make a lot of sense to go ahead and modernize, especially with the upfront costs. But again, even with saying that, there are some really quick wins with the web apps and databases that I urge everyone to investigate and look at if you guys aren't already using this more in your environment. And just moving on to my last slide really quickly. So admin overhead is something I like talking about because it has affected me a lot in my career, and I'm sure all of you guys. Just simple tasks like patching VMs, scaling manually, just tracking costs weekly or monthly, it drains a lot of time from every one of our teams. Automation with Azure, can turn a lot of these burdens into some type of efficiency. So just building on our previous slide about modernization, we need to look at ditching IaaS and third-party hassles where possible. There's a lot of native solutions in Azure that can make our lives a lot easier. If we look at PaaS, like I touched on, the Azure App Services, SQL databases, and again, this eliminates admin overhead, patching, scaling headaches, DR redundancy. There's other services in Azure like Azure Firewall, load balancers, Bastion, DDoS protection, things that can auto adjust. There's no appliance that we need to install. It's very simple to set up. There's no admin, and it just helps us focus on what's really more important, right? If we just touch on some of the services really quickly, like I mentioned, like Bastion is a great service that I think more people should be using. It helps us eliminate the need to have a VPN client in Azure. For secure SSL over HTTPS connections, RDP, SSH to our VMs, spins up a hardened machine that we can connect to. It's a great thing to have. It makes things a lot more efficient. It also removes a lot of hassles for licensing and third-party VPN costs that we need to connect to sometimes. So again, it's a very great solution to try and streamline some costs. And again, a lot of people still use jump boxes in Azure. Azure Bastion can help remove that requirement completely. And if we still need jump boxes in our environment, then again, there are a whole bunch of other services that we can look at, like Azure VDIs, for example, to minimize admin overhead. Now, scaling is another issue that we need to look at in our environments, right? An app service can really match traffic and automate everything as much as possible. From backups, effortless data protection, we could be using Azure policies to automatically fix compliance issues in our environment, like untagged VMs. Automation accounts can help with our patch management. It could help shut down test dev environments to save massive costs in the long run. So it's all things that we should be looking at. And again, if we want to minimize our admin overhead, if we have a hybrid environment or a multi-cloud environment, using solutions like Azure Arc can really help us bridge that gap. It can give us a single plane and management view of our entire environment. And if there's any policies that we have in Azure that we're enforcing to our Azure VMs, we can use Azure Arc to push that back on premise and just get a full view of everything that's going on. So again, just to touch on really quickly, streamlining our reporting is really important, and using things like Azure Functions can really help with that. Tools like Azure Monitor can catch issues and problems in our environment really quickly if they have been configured properly. I've seen it in some cases where you are receiving thousands and thousands of alerts that you're paying for, and it becomes spam. So it's also a balancing act to find out what's important, how to report, and let my teams know what are the actual issues that are happening in the environment. It could save us all a lot of time and money. Then things like Azure Monitor, Azure Cost Management with Power BI can really help streamline our cost reporting. If we're using things like Defender for Cloud, it can ensure compliance and our security posture. Again, these all savings, just freeing up your time and allowing us to innovate more in your environment. So I'm sure if you think back, you must have lost days or weeks just doing admin tasks in your environment, or have a lot of people in your team just bogged down with admin tasks. I've seen it happen a lot. It wastes a lot of time. It wastes a lot of energy. It's not really exciting. There's no innovation that's happening. And if we just look at automating a lot of these overheads, we can really transform your operations and speed things up. So just before I hand back over to Gethin, I just want to say my final message right here is we aren't trying to get the cost down to zero. I'm sure some people would love that, but we're trying to get the most value out of your spend in Azure right now and try and build more trust in Azure so you guys have more time to innovate and look at more solutions that can make your lives easier. And with that, thank you so much for your time, and I'll hand over back to Gethin right now. Gethin, you there?
Oh, can you hear me now?
Yeah, you know.
My headphones was cancelling out the actual unmuted button on Teams. Apologies for that, but thanks, Vic. You probably need a glass of water yourself after that. Yeah. So have a break and I'll try and wrap things up for everyone before we come back to you for a couple of questions that we'll try and pick up on. So I guess, yeah, some really interesting points there from Vic and advice. both in the long term, but also some possible quick wins that are, I guess, kind of key takeaways really from the session that you as an audience can go away and look into straight away. But just to finish the session off, I just wanted to touch on some potential next steps from our side. If you are looking for some help on where to go next with this on the Azure side of things, Cloud Essentials, I've got some possibilities on that front. So we run a detailed and thorough Azure cost optimization assessment, for example. And this is something that we've got a proven methodology for and something that we can help out with straight off the bat. In terms of what it covers, we're looking at areas like, ensuring your Azure environment is both efficient and cost effective. So expanding on everything that Vic has gone through today. It's designed to uncover hidden savings, optimize your cloud spending without compromising performance, like we mentioned before. And I guess during the assessment, we'll conduct a thorough review of your current Azure setup, which includes things like identifying, cost overruns, spotting orphan resources, evaluating your governance and visibility practices. So repeating on some of the stuff that Vic has covered, but we'll also look for, over-provisioned resources and modernization opportunities as well to ensure you're not paying for more than you need. And the goal here is to provide you with real actionable insights, I suppose, and recommendations. So we'll help you implement best practices for cost management, such as, leveraging Azure's built-in tools like Azure Advisor and cost management. And then by the end of the assessment, you'll have a clear roadmap to optimize your Azure costs and improve your overall cloud efficiency. It's definitely a proactive approach to potential upcoming costs. So not helping with not only helping with immediate cost savings, but also setting the foundation for sustainable cost management in the long run as well. Essentially, we're looking at turning potential risks into opportunities for savings and growth. So that's the cost optimization assessment. We're also, want to help you with sort of guiding your cloud journey as well. So another service that we provide is more of an ongoing one. So our support services are designed to ensure that your Azure environment remains optimized and secure, so providing continuous value for your business. We offer a strategic partnership that includes proactive management and ongoing improvement. So it means regular monitoring and maintenance of your cloud resources, as well as proactive identification and resolution of potential issues as well before they actually impact your operations. Our advisory services provide strategic consultations on Azure architecture, security, compliance, governance, all those things that we touched upon. And we also offer a tailored sort of advice to help you integrate the latest Azure features as well and enhancements. And so ensuring your cloud environment evolves with your business needs. And then additionally to that, we provide advanced support services, which includes, tier 3 and 4 support for complex Azure issues and on-demand expert assistance as well during business hours. And on that note as well, we also host knowledge sharing sessions, and these are designed to empower your team with advanced troubleshooting skills and best practices. So overall, what we want to do, through using our ongoing support services is for you to actually, focus on your core business while we take care of the Azure environment, ensuring it remains, like we said, efficient, secure, and aligned with your strategic goals. So any of the above is of interest to discuss with myself or Vic after this, then, please don't hesitate to get in touch. And with that, looking at the time, I think we should have some time for at least a couple of the questions. So Vic, if you've had your glass of water, I hope you have, I'll fire a couple of questions at you and we'll see how much time we've got left to go.
All right.
So first one I've got for you, mate, is what if my app runs 24/7? Does serverless still save me some money?
Yeah, it's a pretty good question. Well, it depends, right? If your application is running 24/7 and there's zero downtime at all, and if we're just looking at the cost per the VM for the serverless, you could potentially end up paying more on serverless, but there are some nuances with that, right? Again, not all applications do run 24/7, and if they do, then sometimes just using a reserved instance on Azure for VM might save you more costs in the long term. But again, it still adds that admin overhead. So if you have accounted for the patching, the admin overhead, the redundancy, the backup, and you've already compared the costs to that, the serverless might slightly run a bit more expensive, but then it would provide a whole bunch more value back in the long term. Just something else to keep in mind with this, not every single solution that you have in your environment is best fit for serverless. And in this case, if an application is running 24/7 in serverless, because might not be the best approach, because you do see a lot of savings in the downtime, but your application will need to be analyzed. It could be a combination. So I could be using IaaS for my front end or back end and using serverless for one of those functions. So you don't have to choose like one or the other. You could have a hybrid approach. And I think it's really important to analyze your application's requirements and advise from there. Yep.
Cool. Thanks, Rick. The next one I've got written down here, just from the chat. So let's go. So the file storage savings sounds great, but what about retrieval costs for analytics workloads? Doesn't that kill the 95% savings with Blob Archive?
Yeah, it's a pretty good question. So it depends, right? If I have, just say, a Blob storage account in Azure right now that I've chosen to mark as archive storage, and I'm accessing this data constantly, either by using some type of analytics or from my Fabric or Synapses or whatever, then I chose the wrong tier from the get-go, which is why all the different tiers in Azure, they do have their use cases, and not every single tier is going to be a best fit. If we stick that on archive storage and we are accessing terabytes all the time, it might be cheaper at some point to just have a VM with a disk attached to it, which is not great, right? So if you just look at the tiering and the requirements, sometimes cool storage might be more effective, or a combination of cool and hot. Again, it all depends on what our environment is doing, what our application requirements are, and we will need to analyze everything on a per case basis. There's no blanket solution right now that's going to cover everyone in every single environment. All our applications are different. The way we use them are different. They have different requirements, so we need to analyze them on a case-by-case basis. But before I just close that off, Gethin, if we had a look at maybe cool storage, right, like I mentioned, we could still see some type of saving up to 60 or 70%. It all depends on how often the data has been accessed. And if it's been accessed constantly, I'm pretty sure a hot storage blob would still be cheaper than running a VM with attached disk to it. Are there any more questions, Gethin? And Gethin is frozen. Maybe dropped off. Are you back?
Sorry, guys. Apologies for that. I hope I didn't miss too much. I was going to find you. Did you cover any more, Vic? Sorry, I've just connected to my phone now because my Wi-Fi had dropped. Did you cover any more questions, or shall I fire one more at you?
No, I wanted to check if there were any more questions that we could answer really quickly before we close off.
Yeah, okay, let's go with one more then. There's one more here. You mentioned native services like Azure Firewall save on licensing, but what about advanced features? Don't third-party tools offer better threat detection and security features for the cost?
Oh, that's a hard question. So it depends, right? It all depends on your actual requirements. Now, there's a lot of third-party tools in the marketplace right now, security appliances, that probably do what Azure Firewall does, maybe better. But again, Azure has other services in the ecosystem to supplement that. Now, if you just look at your requirements again, if you require a really basic firewall in Azure to just do some basic rules from maybe on-premise to your Azure resources, Azure Firewall will win, I would say, 9 out of 10 times. There's no license costs. It scales on demand. So if the load increases and it scales up to 20 times, it's not going to charge you for that scaling. It's a great solution. There's no admin overhead, there's no backups. There's nothing to really worry about. But then if you're looking at advanced threat protection, Azure Firewall can't do that, but Microsoft SIEM has those capabilities, and I know Azure Firewall integrates into Microsoft SIEM. So if we are using Microsoft SIEM already in your environment, then maybe Azure Firewall should be something that you're looking at to try and cut down costs. And if it's something that interests you, maybe should we be looking at Microsoft SIEM? That's a broader discussion then. Are there any other products in our environment that we can replace by using SIEM? So I hope that answers your question. And I do know that Azure Firewall does have 2 different SKUs, from standard and premium, with additional security features. And like all the other tools that I mentioned right now, from Bastion to Azure Arc, Azure Firewall, there's been a lot of enhancements and improvements that Microsoft have done over the past 2 years on these products. So if you are worried about a product not doing something or having that feature, it's really great to look at the product roadmap. And if it's something that you're consuming and you know for a fact that it could be a benefit and could be used, then you should probably reach out to your Microsoft account manager to get them to speak to the product team for enhancements.
Perfect. Thank you, Vic. And thanks. I think we're going to stop there at this point. So thanks everyone for your time today. Hopefully some really great insights there to take away from the session today. Please reach out to us for any further information. I'm sure we'll be in touch as well, just to get some feedback and see whether there's some interest in some of those next steps. But yeah, please reach out if there are any further specific questions. And if there are ones on the chat that we haven't answered yet, we'll be sure to reach out specifically on those as well. But thanks everyone for your time. Really appreciate it. Another great session. And we look forward to the next one in April. Cheers all.